Hello everyone, I'm Hannes Machor, the Director of the Cultural Forum and Deputy Head of Mission at the Austrian Embassy in Ottawa. I'm pleased to welcome you to this conversation, which focuses on the importance of quality education for a more sustainable future. 2015, member states of the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a blueprint for achieving a better and more sustainable future for all. The current COVID pandemic is proof positive of how important international cooperation is to dealing with global challenges. Every country has a role in promoting sustainable development. And my country, Austria, developed a mainstream approach. Each ministry integrates the goals into their strategy program. The provinces, the municipalities, business sector, science, academia, civil society do so as well. Austria promotes sustainable development internationally as a donor country, as a member of international organizations, but also by promoting international dialogue. Now, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is education. And this brings us to the topic of our conversation today. The education goal calls on member states to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. What does this goal entail? How does it change the way we look at education? How can education live up to its potential to be at the core of all efforts towards a more sustainable future? I'm pleased to welcome two distinguished panelists who will discuss these very questions. Monika Fröhler, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens in Vienna, and Charles Hopkins, who is the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education on Sustainability at York University, Toronto. Also joining us is Katrin Kohl and Andreas Strebinger, both from York University. Andreas is a professor with the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University. And Andreas also serves as the head of the Toronto and South Central Canada chapter of the Association of Austrian Scholars and Scientists in North America. Katrin is the executive coordinator to the UNESCO chair at York University, and Katrin is also focal point for Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on quality education for the International Association of Universities. Katrin has long been involved with UNESCO's work. Katrin will moderate the chat, and Andreas will be moderating the discussion. Thank you both. And to help us understand the conversation, we have Lana Lauren. Lana is a Vienna-based graphic recording artist. She will capture the discussion with her real-time illustrations. Thank you all for participating. I also thank our viewers for joining us in what I'm sure will be an enlightening and informative session. I now invite Katrin to set the stage for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks to the Austrian Cultural Forum here in Ottawa at the Austrian Embassy and the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens in Vienna for partnering for this event. It's a pleasure to be here, and hi to everyone. It's actually nice to see so many familiar faces. It's good to see your names and even see your cameras. Nice to know that you're doing well through these difficult times. As many of you know, the 2030 Agenda with the SDGs are a new opportunity for all of us to move towards a better future for all, as all United Nations member states have signed on and recognized the 17 most pressing global sustainability themes and challenges. These 17 challenges are not just the results of government negotiations, but they are also the result of what people want. Under the leadership of former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, people had a say in worldwide consultations to define these 17 SDGs. And unlike the former Millennium Development Goals that only aimed at the developing world, the SDGs apply to all of us in each and every country. In Canada, we follow a national strategy as well towards achieving the SDGs, and we're aiming to put the SDGs as a framework for our country's development. Based on voluntary reviews out of 166 countries, I'm happy to say that Canada currently holds rank 21 in the overall SDG implementation scheme. Austria even, congratulations, holds rank 7. As I can see from the names that many of you are joining from other countries, I'm going to soon post the link to the SDG implementation ranking so you can check on your own country. For Canada and worldwide, quality education is a key enabler and central for the success of the 2030 agenda as a whole. The designated SDG 4 involves all levels of education, from early childhood towards continuing education and lifelong learning. Two guiding principles of a quality education are education for sustainable development, ESD, and global citizenship education, GCED, recognized as vital means of implementation, addressed in SDG 4.7, but applicable to all of SDG 4. A quality education needs to inspire, to develop the knowledge and the skills, to actually take action in a transformative and responsible way. ESD and GCED, Education for Sustainable Development, and Global Citizenship Education, can unleash such change in the individual and in the collective. Today's discussion will focus on these two concepts, their potential and their synergies. I'm looking forward to an interesting dialogue, and I will now hand it over to my colleague Andreas for the introduction of our distinguished speakers.
Thank you very much, Hannes and Katrin. So I hope I'm now unmuted. The host muted me, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Hannes and Katrin, for this very informative context and framework for our panel today. It is a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel and the discussion. And I have the honor of telling you now a bit more about our two distinguished panelists, Monica Fröhler and Charles Hopkins. I know many of you are already very familiar with them, but I think it's very informative to also know the context of their work and how they came into their position. Monica Fröhler is a passionate change maker, an advocate and founder and speaker. She was entrusted with creating the Ban Ki-moon Center after working at the United Nations in Geneva, New York City, and Vienna. Also the European Union, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and she was on field missions around the globe. She's very passionate about the implementation of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. And throughout her career, she has supported hundreds of women, young people, communities all over the globe. For example, working in Africa, Latin America to ban landmines, improving healthcare in rural Central Asia and Africa, assisting in eco-friendly city planning in Asia, and working on bettering the living conditions of women in the Middle East and West Africa. And I also learned that, fitting her Austrian roots, she's also a very musical person, a dancer, a composer, and even a songwriter. So maybe later we get a bit of a sample of your songs, or maybe not. Charles Hopkins holds the UNESCO chair in reorienting education towards sustainability at York University, serving the United Nations Global Education 2030 agenda with research and in coordinating 2 global networks: the International Network of Teacher Education Institutions and the Indigenous ESD Research Network, which focuses on the education of Indigenous youth. Charles is also advisor to the Global Network of Regional Centers of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development, ESD, associated with the United Nations University, and co-director of the Asia Pacific Institute on ESD in Beijing, China. Charles is also interested in arts and especially collecting indigenous protest art. So let's see also his impressions then of Lana's artistic connotations of our discussion. So normally I would ask now for a round of applause for our distinguished speakers. I don't know how to do this on Zoom, so maybe we can have a show of hands, or a show of hands on your screen, or the applause in the reactions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Monica. Each of them will first give a short introduction into their work, their institutions, and their thoughts of about 8 minutes. Before we open the floor for the discussion, we will then have around 35 minutes for Hannes, for Charles, and for Monica to answer your questions. And then Hannes will do the closing words at around 1:15 p.m. Without much further ado, I would like to hand over to Monica for her introductory thoughts.
Thanks so much to all of the previous speakers. It's a pleasure to be here with the Austrian Cultural Forum, the Austrian Embassy, also York University. And of course, Charles, it's an honor to be on the same panel as you are. So 8 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, I would like to see your faces. So for those of you who are able to switch on your videos, please do so. It's always nicer to talk to the people directly rather than to just see their names. The Ban Ki-moon Center. I am the CEO of the Ban Ki-moon Center. I have the privilege to serve the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself and his good friend Heinz Fischer, who is the 11th Federal President of the Republic of Austria. And you have to imagine that in the summer 2016, the two took a hike together in the mountains. And it was pretty evident that Ban Ki-moon wanted to have a legacy institution that could carry forward his major achievements for which he will probably be famous even past his lifetime, one of which being the Sustainable Development Goals and the other one being the Paris Climate Agreement. And it took little for Heinz Fischer to agree to offer such an institute. And I was entrusted to found it, and it became the Ban Ki-moon Center, which is a quasi-international organization that was launched in January 2018. So what do we do? Out of the whole big array of topics that Ban Ki-moon could have chosen, he chose the SDGs, because he said what's really crucial is that we empower women and youth to become change makers and advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do that, next slide, thank you, of course, on the basis of the framework of the SDGs. But we also do that with the notion of global citizenship. Now, I know that I'm here today talking to really experts on that subject matter. But to recap where even Ban Ki-moon's connotation of that term comes from, let's look at the actual SDG 4 target 7. Because we all know SDG 4, the goal, wants quality education for all. And target number 7 on the goal 4 actually emphasizes the need for education for sustainable development and for global citizenship. Now, you can imagine Ban Ki-moon after 10 years of his time as SG, like Neil Armstrong, like Nelson Mandela, like other people who have seen the world, came to the conclusion that we have more in common than what actually divides us. And he believes that's best encapsulated in the notion of global citizenship. And yet he saw in his interactions with many leaders of the world that this mindset of global thinking was missing. And he said his task for the remaining years of his life has to be that he's instilling that notion of global citizenship in future young leaders. His quote that is at the bottom of this slide, "Be a global citizen, act with passion and compassion," is one of the key terms that people associate with him still, even with his tenure as SG. So what does that mean? Global citizenship means, global citizenship education in our understanding at the Ban Ki-moon Center means SDG knowledge, 21st century skills and competencies, and global citizen values. Next slide, let me go a bit more into the detail of that. So competencies, probably many of you had a look already at the OECD study on global competency assessment. It was recently just published, and it very much looks at the skills, the knowledge, the values, and the attitudes of young people, but also all of us, because we're talking about lifelong learning when it comes to global citizenship education. And it's been a popular term that is often equated with global citizenship. So global citizenship education, global competence education, it's obviously not all the same, but there are, of course, great analogies. What we witness currently in the world is that even the private sector is more interested in global citizenship thinking, because why? This whole concept of social entrepreneurship has launched new careers in all sorts of fields. Even now during COVID, we see that social entrepreneurship is actually on the rise. We also see a manifestation of this notion of global citizenship in youth movements, most prominently probably Fridays for Future, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too, that are engaging in international, cross-cultural, cross-boundary questions. And also probably those of you who work or who are of the generation of millennials and Gen Y, Gen Z, you know that Gen Y, Gen Z actually seeks workplaces where they are expecting to find purpose and engagement for social causes that often are not limited just to national borders, but are spanning the globe. Next slide. So when we're talking, next slide, wonderful. When we're talking about 21st century skills, obviously there are many definitions out there. For the sake of the Ban Ki-moon Center, we are distinguishing between the learning skills, the literacy skills, and the life skills. So the learning skills, the famous 4 C's of critical thinking and creativity and collaboration and communication, which often are not taught separately, but are just enshrined in the curricula, which is great, but sometimes they are not even paid attention to at all. In the case of literacy skills, we are very much focusing that learners can distinguish facts from non-facts and understand the technology behind it. So it's very much about information and media and technology, etc. In the case of life skills, which is probably the least tangible, or the one that is often accused to be fluffy, we are talking very much about flexibility, about, for example, productivity, social skills. Empathy is a life skill. So the intangible elements of the learner's everyday experience. Next slide. So when GCED is about these 3 notions that I stipulated, the global citizen values, the competencies and skills, but also the knowledge. How do we do it? Let me go into the nuts and bolts of how the Ban Ki-moon Center approaches this. We have 4 pillars in our working mode. One is leadership, one is peace and security and mediation, one is advocacy, and the 4th one is education. Education, of course, being key to our engagement today, but let me lead you to the others as well. In the case of leadership, I already told you Ban Ki-moon wants to have a generation of inspired change makers. And we do that by offering fellowships, mentorships, and scholarships involving learners aged 18 to 30, particularly from all over the globe, to inspire them. And we accompany them and hopefully help them in implementing so-called SDG micro projects, but I will come to that a bit later. In the case of peace, security, and mediation, we want to have more young representatives at the table of decision-making when it comes to peace building, security considerations, and even mediation. So we're working with UNODC, also with CTPTO, the UN Youth Envoy, the OSCE, IPI, and many others. In the case of advocacy, we are fortunate to be standing on the shoulders of giants like UNESCO, and I'm very happy that Charles Hopkins is joining us today, the chair of UNESCO, and then SDSN, of course, the Sustainable Development.
And for your tolerance and listening to this. Yep. Oh no, you're fine.
I hear someone had his mic unmuted. So we have the pleasure of working with Sustainable Development Solution Network and also the Global Schools. This is crucial as it's Mission 4.7. We have gathered our forces to implement GCED worldwide even more effectively, working with a multitude of partners. In the case of education, we are offering online classes, and we are offering also our capacities for GCED research. So right now, research is undertaken about all of the network partners in the United States and Canada, so Northern America, plus Europe, and what interlinkages exist. We are interested in that. There is not yet a research out, and we are hopeful that Schulz and Tarozzi, two professors that we're working with, will soon publish that. One from the University of Alberta in Canada. Next slide. So Mission 4.7, I briefly alluded to it, and I will only touch base on it once more by saying this is probably the biggest policy effort that the Ban Ki-moon Center is currently undertaking in matters of global citizenship education. Here on the picture, you see the Pope and Ban Ki-moon shaking hands. Policy is very much in favor of integrating the notion of global citizenship education worldwide and elevating the portfolio. So this is what we do by talking not only to ministers, but also to teachers' unions and student unions, etc., really with the goal of transforming learning and teaching. While ESD and GCED have to be seen as the same coin, but just simply two sides of the same coin. Next slide. So fellowships, we are offering fellowships for people from Asia, Latin America, GCC, Arab League, Central Asia, and we are training them in Vienna. COVID times now delay that physical training, but we of course have switched to webinars, but are hoping for the physical component to soon manifest again. And we are hosting them for SDG micro projects, which they implement in their respective home countries. Similarly, next slide. The mentors, we have a mentorship program where mentors from universities, often from universities or professionals, are assisting young change makers to actually implement what they have found as a challenge in their own community and implement it on the ground in form of SDG micro projects. Next slide. The scholars are equally well young, ambitious change makers who we raise in their portfolio with trainings, participation in expert workshops, high-level forums, exposure to our board, exposure to Ban Ki-moon, but also even sometimes with the possibility of pitching towards funders for their established or generated micro projects. Next slide. So these micro projects, well, let's go to the next slide immediately because I've already spoken about them quite a bit. In the meantime, the Ban Ki-moon Center has a number of about 100 that are active currently around the globe with amazing young representatives who are dealing with all sorts of SDG aspects and are putting their action into recycling, into gender equality, into energy, into all sorts of things. And here you have some examples from Cambodia, Afghanistan, from the Middle East. In this case, I think it was Saudi and the podcast in Saudi, Ghana, Kenya. So we are very fortunate to have, next slide, in the meantime, touched 700,000 people with these SDG micro projects, about 100, as I said, active across the globe. Youth in Peacebuilding, I told you before, the Ban Ki-moon Center wants to have more youth representatives at the table when peace is made. We are, of course, basing our interventions on UN Security Council resolutions in this regard, and I've already named who we are working with, but that's also sort of an application of global citizenship thinking. Next slide. Our online courses, no surprise here, pertain to exactly the subject matters that I have touched: SDGs, global citizenship, but also gender equality and women's empowerment. There are definitely more to come. In the meantime, we have about 20,000 subscribers to our online courses, which are freely available on all sorts of platforms, including Coursera and UPSEU, UNESCO UPSEU, which is surely known by many of you. Next slide. We are working with universities, particularly the ENLIGHT University Network in Europe, constituted of 9 universities that hosts altogether more than 300,000 students. And with them, we are linking forces also for Mission 4.7, so for really including GCED and also ESD into the curricula, but also to instill an action mindset and have the students go out and practice global citizenship in real term, in their lives, in their vicinity, in their neighborhood. Next slide. So impact, about 700,000 people reached with the SDG micro-projects. We have lots of mentees, scholars, and fellows. And indeed, we are very happy to have already in the meantime obtained 20 plus donor organizations. And events like today are excellent speaking engagements where we get to know the community even better, and the community gets to know us, the Ban Ki-moon Center, even a bit better in the 40 countries that we have reached and beyond. Next slide. So you can obviously get involved with us, can learn, act, and connect with the Ban Ki-moon Center. We learn from you, we act with you, and we connect to you as well. On our website, you can find out the details of that. And I think that takes me to the last slide, as I have definitely used up my minutes already. So thank you, Andreas, for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Monica, for this very impressive overview of your work. And speaking of impressions, maybe we can switch over to Lana for a moment and see her impressions of the work of Monica and the Ban Ki-moon Center. And maybe, Monica, you want to comment on them?
Gladly. And maybe Lana, you can also comment on them. Oh, that's a portrait of me, I think.
Yes, it's you, Monica. So the first talk we heard was from Monica, the CEO of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens. And the summary that I made during the talk was the focus of the Ban Ki-moon Center to carry on the legacy of Ban Ki-moon and his decision to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that the SDG knowledge has to be enhanced, and also that a big focus is in lifelong learning. We learned that a big factor is also nowadays the role of public-private partnership, as well as youth movements like we had the Fridays for Futures or Black Lives Matter, and also the involvement of millennials, Generation Y and Generation Z, so the younger people. The goal is to create a generation of young change makers, and this will be reached among other means by micro SDG projects that we heard of, and the GCED in 2020 and 2021 focus on leadership, advocacy, education, peace, security, and mediation. Also, we saw a very impressive slide with the impact that has already been made in 2020. Two of the things that are picked out from the numbers were 40 countries reached worldwide and 700,000 people reached, which is amazing.
Thank you, Lana. Don't need to comment there. And I think I'm curious about Charles's remarks.
Thank you very much, Lana and Monica, and that's a great segue to the short introductory presentation of Charles, which I'm now handing over.
Well, thanks, Monica, and really enlightening. This is, I think, the first time we've shared the stage, and I've been able to really see the tremendous work that the Ban Ki-moon Center is doing. It is truly impressive. But let me also say thanks to the Austrian Embassy here in Ottawa for arranging this presentation and the opportunity to explore the synergy, the potential synergy between ESD and global citizenship education. You know, once again, the world's education systems are called upon to, well, this time transform, not just sort of rejuvenate or change one discipline or upgrade and so on, but actually to transform. And what is so different is that the focus has to be on what we perceive the future to be, because no one really knows. And it's not only to transform to serve the individual student, but now we realize we need to transform to address humanity in its entirety, and address the impact that we have upon the planet. as Monica pointed out in SDG 4.7, you know, that opening remark about by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed in sustainable development. So how do we do that? And so we were asked to share a little bit about our work and then talk about the synergy and the differences and so on between our two respective sort of areas of expertise and action. I say a few words about our chair at York University. First of all, the UNESCO chairs are a system that are set up where universities and UNESCO itself agree to create a center of expertise within the university that will focus its teaching, its research, and community service really as global service to further the actions and the ideals and the goals of UNESCO itself. My UNESCO chair here at York was the first one in the world to address education for sustainable development and was created back in 1999. Our work is largely around international networks of research. We have one large one on international network of teacher education institutions. That was the very first request of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development when it was first formed, was how do we engage the world's millions and millions of teachers? And so we looked at how could we reform teacher education. Very, very difficult to do, but that was our task. We now have a network that spans about 50 countries and several hundred institutions. We have a second one looking at how education for sustainable development could perhaps improve the quality of education of the world's least well-served students, and largely being the world's indigenous around the world. We also coordinate with the International Association of Universities. They have put together global clusters of universities working on each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and our chair coordinates SDG 4 at the heart of it all. And of course, in a few days in Berlin will be the launch of ESD for 2030, the 10-year program paralleling the Sustainable Development Goals, but focusing on education for sustainable development. And we will be a key partner within that. And our fields of interest include, what is a quality education? Can you really have a quality education, 21st century skills that do not address the sustainable future, I mean, both for humans, but for all life? We look at the education for sustainable development, its relationship to the broader sustainable development goals and the 2030 agenda. And of course, we're very into the education research around Indigenous. Not just how do we impose math and language in them in a better, more functional way, but in true dialogue, and what do they perceive as quality education? And of course, addressing our need to learn from them as well. As we know we must change our particular worldviews and perspectives and so on. We need all of the access to dialogues from a variety of regions. We work closely with United Nations University. Their Institute for Advanced Studies in Sustainability have a program out into 179 cities and regions around the world, looking at how a more knowledgeable general public could help to make a more sustainable community, and then the importance of trying to bring, some call it greening, right? Through technical and vocational education to address small to medium-sized enterprise around the world. Large businesses get it with their VP sustainability and marketing and so on, but almost 97% of the world's economy is small to medium-sized business. And how do we do that? And again, a role for education, public awareness, and training. And then because we are located at York, we become embedded in the overall university academic plan at York that embeds everything that we do, the teaching, the operations, and so on, in that context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's sort of our setting. We do a lot of travel, a lot of, not at this year, but I guess our university chair has delivered lectures in more than 70 countries around the world over that time, since 1999. The other thing is to try and put it all in perspective, because as you approach educators, their focus is largely on their school rankings and so on. And how do you break into that? As a former school superintendent and superintendent of curriculum, I know it is extremely difficult to reorient, to change, and so on. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But our programs, both GCED and ESD, are part of implementation plans of larger schemes. So at the end of the Second World War, the big scheme to prevent war was the creation of the United Nations. And one of the first things they addressed as a means of implementing the concept of the UN was to create UNESCO, because they said it's in the minds of men and women that war sort of emerged, and so it's in the minds of men and women that peace must be created. But the first one really around sustainable development came in 1987 to try and solve the deadlock between 80% of the world, that the former colonies and so on, that needed development, and those that saw the environmental impact and so on of their development and trying to slow it down and preserve. So there was that clash between environment and preservation and development. And the answer to that, as we know, through our common future, was the idea of sustainable development. But what do? The UN can adopt the concept, but how do you implement it? And so the very first implementation plan was Agenda 21. Okay? And then that was addressing all countries. It had 40 different chapters within it and things that needed to be done. That went to 2000 when we had the Millennium Development Goals, and as Catherine pointed out earlier, it was only addressed to the most needy countries and reduced to 8 goals. Then, under the leadership of Ban Ki-moon, that was to go from 2000 to 2015. Ban Ki-moon saw that just dealing with the least developed countries was not going to save the entire planet. And so we opened up massive consultations, the world we want. And it was out of the thousands of recommendations and consultations and ideas that it was able to boil it down. And hence we come up with the current implementation plan, the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so that's sort of the context of what they are. But the Sustainable Development Goals have sort of a means of implementation. And throughout each one of these, whether it was Agenda 21 that had its own chapter, chapter 36 on education, public awareness and training, or the Millennium Development Goals that had its targets on education, and the world we want and the Sustainable Development Goals, again, highlighting education, public awareness and training. Now, as I said, reorienting education is not easy. And first of all, I have to understand what it is. And with Education for Sustainable Development, I can share some insight. I was one of the 10 authors of the original Education for Sustainable Development sort of context, when 10 of us from around the world representing the private sector, representing higher education, K through 12 education, non-formal education, and so on, we came together and over 3 years prepared the chapter on education, public awareness, and training. And it all boiled down, one of the earliest discussions was the need, one of the 10 said, we need much better recycling. If we just have recycling, that will do it. And the dean of the Faculty of Education of Cairo was one of the 10, and he said, I have several 100,000 children who are very, very good at recycling. They live in the dumps of Cairo. They need an education if we're going to develop. And so that took us aback, and we realized that we were talking about a much bigger thing, that one of the first goals was access and retention in a quality education. So we could have development of any kind, let alone But the second thing was recognizing it was our most educated countries that were leaving the deepest ecological footprints, and the need to reorient the purpose of education. And that's sort of that other component. The third was under public awareness and understanding, support of political action and change and so on. And the fourth was training programs of all sorts. So that understanding sort of where we are. But we also recognized that we were talking about all of education, right? We were talking about reorienting education systems. It wasn't about adding another, what we called adjectival education to it, where you have to add the kind of thing, whether it's peace education, driver education, anti-drug education. No, we wanted to embrace the whole of the education system and repurpose it to include addressing sustainability. But the United Nations has realized that as a means of implementation, we weren't just targeting and focusing on SDG 4. That really the ideas of global citizenship education, and in particular education for sustainable development, that it's a means of implementing all of the sustainable development goals. Just as back in Agenda 21 in 1992, education, public awareness, and training was mentioned in all 40 chapters, whether it was oceans, mountain ecosystems, whatever. The idea of public understanding and training and education was core to it. So the different range of, unfortunately, in many education systems, they're either not aware or choose to focus on something else, and it is not yet addressed. So that's where our work lies out. Some make token, and they have clubs or events and so on, Vegetarian Thursday or something along that nature, and it's there. Some teach about sustainable development as a concept, but what we're really asking is that we reorient and make it a purpose, where we are actually teaching for a more sustainable future, and some even embed it and link it within what is actually going on in the community. So there's a few words about what we do and the context of education for sustainable development, and you can see the parallel and purpose with GCED. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this wonderful introduction into your wonderful and fascinating world. We will, in a moment, again discuss or ask Lana to help us interpret her work. And I know Charles is an arts lover and collector, so he will also weigh in on this. Thereafter, we will start our discussion forum, and we will do so on the chat. So I'm already inviting everybody to start and share your comments, start your questions in the chat, so we can then seamlessly address them after we have seen Lana's work.
So a very quick summary of Charles's talk from my side. We heard the following. So we heard that education for sustainable development goals is a very important task that was also recognized by the UNESCO in 1999 when the first chair on ESD was founded at the York University. It's about reforming teacher education and also addressing sustainable future. It targets also indigenous communities and tries to establish real dialogues with them to figure out how it's possible to support them in the best way. We saw a timeline that was really interesting where we started with 1945, the start of the United Nations, then going to 87, Brundtland, 92, Agenda 21, and then 2000, the Millennium Development Goals that had a very big difference to the SDGs we have nowadays, namely that they were only targeting the least developed countries, which changed in 2015 when the SDGs started and the 70 Sustainable Development Goals now realize that in order to make real change, everybody has to be included. What we heard also was a conversation about whether recycling might be one of the essential topics and how one of the members replied that, well, he has a lot of children that are good at recycling, but what they actually would need is education, and that ESD is way more than only SDG 4, but that it is about education on all the sustainable development goals. That's for me. Charles, did I miss something? Do you want to?
Oh, that's right on. We should have had you present it at the beginning, and then.
Oh no! I can only repeat what you said.
But I do want to collect it.
You will. I'm sure you will receive a copy. I will be honored. So now I think we can move to questions, right, Andreas?
I think so too. Yeah. So let's have an option of Lana's work at the end if there's more people interested. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm opening the floor now for the discussion, and we have already one question, this question comes from Dr. Kioma Blaise Chikere. I hope I'm pronouncing that approximately right. And he thanks for the impactful presentation. And the question is to the practical application of the work and asks how do Nigerian universities, researchers and lecturers benefit from these initiatives? And I think I can expand the question to both panelists, although originally it was just addressed to Monica. I hope, Kioma, that's okay with you.
Excellent. Maybe I can already start answering it while Charles is probably still thinking about it. I have time. This is a wonderful question because Dr. Chikere, it would be wonderful to be in touch with you after this event. You are surely someone who is interested in the first place in GCED and ESD, so that's good to know. How do Nigerian universities already benefit from the initiatives? Well, there are many answers to this. We have scholars and fellows and mentees from Nigerian universities, but also I'd say all across Africa. We have particularly dedicated our scholarship programs now in the second year, and then the second year this year and last year, to African scholars. And I tell you, it's been incredible who we managed to support in this regard. You saw some on my map on the SDG micro projects. We are, of course, have been working closely with Aya Chebi, the African Union Youth Envoy, to reach more and more young people in Africa. So it's fantastic to have a linking pin to you and your university in Nigeria with the scholars program. Right now, the application deadline has just passed. My team is currently going through hundreds of applications to chisel it out with the 6 that will be chosen for this year to become Ban Ki-moon Center scholars, which of course is a drop in the ocean, but the more funding we have, the more scholars we can take on. Yet another thing for Africa is our mentorship program. We have a mentorship program up and running where we are interested in African lecturers and faculty staff members as much as African scholars. So there too, please check our website. The mentorship program is particularly this year arched around young women in health, So we are interested in that and are interested in Nigerian experts, but all African experts pretty much. And then there are stipends that we are offering. And here as well, the application deadline, I think, could be done just this week. We are offering a course for African scholars for the university at the University of Ghent on sexual and health and reproductive rights. That's one of the courses, and the other one is on global health in general. And these stipends, it's fully funded by us. It's an online program that they can subscribe to, and we will hopefully soon have candidates there as well. We are always keen to have partners in Africa, so please reach out to us. My team will leave the email address gladly of the Ban Ki-moon Center, but you can find it also on the website. It's office@bankimooncenter.org to link up to us, to become a mentor, to become a faculty member who we can draw on in our rosters. So these are very concrete things that I can already say. Over to you, Charles, I guess.
Thank you. Yes, we have in our teacher education network, there are 7 universities, I believe, in Nigeria that are linked together and as a cluster. Our work there has been largely with faculties of education, and I see that you're in the Department of Microbiology. But with the pandemic and with the issues of public health in general in Nigeria, I think it would be fantastic to have teachers, and in particular teacher educators, to have access to current local knowledge of what are the public health issues, and especially around microbiology and so on, to inform them. The trick is always to make our work locally relevant, culturally appropriate, and so on. And so that's why we work in independent units in countries around the world who then share big ideas, but it's important for it to be localized. And we'll be able to send you privately a contact person who sort of leads that Nigerian network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles and Monica, and also Dr. Chikere for the question. We have a second question from Anne Finlayson. How do you message change in teaching practice? I think it's a very good question, how to embed GCED ESD into the classroom, basically. Mm. Okay, and Anne just corrected, how do you measure change in teaching practice? Thank you, Anne.
That's not fair, Anne. You're making it much more difficult.
I know.
Trying to measure it so that you can use that to get more funds or to do things, because the impact is really a personal one, and it could only be 4 or 5% in a class that really need a particular shift of perspective. But that shows out that it was only effective to 5%. So why waste the money on it? Whether it's anti-racism or whether it is changing a perspective of respect for nature and so on. Our whole concept of measurement is really what is holding back a lot of our work in hands-on learning. That's really what it boils down to. It is appropriate pedagogy. And what we're learning is that so much of it, as we crowd the curriculum, we try and put much more into it, and we don't do slow learning. it takes too much time to take the students out and encounter reality, whether it's in the natural world or the built environment or whatever. It takes too much time because the curriculum is too crowded. And so we skip along learning about it. And it makes it very, very difficult to continually assess and measure sort of strictly the profound learning. You can do something on Friday for what they picked up during the week, but the profound transformative change of worldview, perspective, their concept of what is important to me, and even assuming responsibility for their own learning, which is probably the most important thing we can do. How do you measure that? I don't thank you for the question, Anne. Thank you.
I have to thank you, Anne, for the question, because it's the million-dollar question that UNESCO tries to solve now for a couple of, I'd say, even years, ever since the SDGs exist, because the notion is you can only improve what you can measure, and you need to have data before you can at all laser sharp intervene. And particularly with the concept of ESD and GCED, how do you measure that, as Charles has very eloquently put? How do you measure the change in people? How do you measure individual reflection or even action? So it's the million-dollar question. Of course, there are attempts to do so. And I don't say that these attempts are completely volatile, but probably falling short of what should be done, because right now it's often a count of the word of GCED or ESD mentioned in national curricula, mentioned in national policy, mentioned in statements that politicians give on that subject matter. And it's that count of words that reflects whether the notion has, at least at policy level, taken some hold. That data, of course, falls absolutely short of exploring whether it manifested, whether it trickled down to the actual individual in class. And it's yet only a first step, but it is an indicator whether a country at a policy level is interested in the subject matter at all. And what's encouraging in this respect is that more and more countries actually come on board. So we have seen from 2015 to now an amazing increase of engagement at national level, but also at regional level, and then at teachers' level, absolutely. And that's the beauty of it, students are asking for it. So it's really the top-down, bottom-up that is happening at the same time. How do you measure that? Well, I would say, in my positivist kind of approach to it, you see it happening in the world, because more and more young people want jobs that have the social component, that have the global citizenship mindset. They are demanding to be employed by companies that are seeing a CSR component in their portfolios, and they want to be responsible citizens. You see it in movements that I have mentioned before, movements that are driven by the youth. They are taking up the torch to basically shed light on exactly that. So how do you measure that? Of course, it's definitely not a satisfactory measure. And yes, we have a data problem, particularly with less developed countries, but that's overarching for all of the SDGs. We have, as you know, statistical commissions that the UN is drawing upon to gather the data, and often the funds are lacking, the data is missing, and yet now with the new digital means, fortunately, we are making leaps, but again, the gap is widening between those that are connected to the internet, those that are not connected to the internet. So of course, it's an endless field, and Anne, you pointed your finger at exactly a major problem that we have. Measuring GCED, ESD, and the change that is taking place in pedagogic exercise in the formal, informal, preschool up to lifelong learning is one of the most tricky measures that the UN currently has to wrap its head around, and that all of us have to wrap our heads around.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Charles. And thank you, Anne, for this great question. And the next question actually builds upon it, at least on this idea of lifelong learning, and takes us to early childhood education. Thank you, Yekta, and welcome. So Yekta is asking how this can be taken to early childhood teachers for qualitative practices, specifically ESD. And maybe Charles, you want to weigh in first on this?
Yeah, is that the question from Turkey at the Early Childhood Education Department? Yeah, yeah. We don't need a separate course in education for sustainable development or a new course in ESD. There are, I think, two approaches that are going on around the world, and one of them is embedding sustainability in the whole of education, that being education for sustainable development. The other is the concept of sustainability education, which, like peace education, environmental education, driver education. I have a list of about 100 of these that when I was superintendent of curriculum, that people came in with binders and said, add this to the curriculum, which of course, realistically, there are things that we need because the 8 subjects of a core curriculum do not prepare people for life. So it's that idea. But what our chair is not adding a course on ESD. No, we're trying to embed it in math, language, history, and so on. Now that's the reorienting part. Remember I said there were 4 aspects. The first, though, is access and retention in quality education. And in SDG 4.2, it's asking for all to have early childhood education, a quality early childhood education. And within that, I would say you would embed, everything from how do you share the sandbox with one another, that you start with the building as to how do you share the world's natural resources later on in life. But those aspects of caring, sharing, passion and compassion, those core aspects are formed in early childhood. So I think every early childhood teacher who knows and is an excellent early childhood developer would have the means and the ways to embed social justice, equity, a love of nature, and so on within their early childhood program. I really am against trying to think of it as something to do Friday mornings from 9 to 10.
I can only motion that so much, Charles. And just to add my 2 cents to that, I was happy to attend a couple of GCED conferences in my life. And we had workshops where we were introduced to concrete, how do you teach GCED, even preschool, to kids. And what we did was from music to cooking to arts to even theater. Fairy tales were told to us, and we then had to act. Probably the fairy tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, and it was used to showcase what happens in a society if a ruler pretends and a child calls him out. What happens at schools, what happens to the child, what happens to the emperor, what's right and what is wrong. And we were immediately immersed in global citizenship and ESD subjects of empathy, compassion by playing a fairy tale. So there are so many ways, and goosebump creating ways of involving kids at a very sort of low level of cognitive knowledge that is necessary on a very emotional level. So as Charles said, no separation of the subject, but embedding it into the workings of everyday life.
Thanks, Jekta, Monica, and Charles. Very interesting topic, and we have an also very interesting suggestion from Professor Harmon Walker of George Washington Law School about the measurement issue, which should start maybe at the level of exposure of students. So how many students are actually familiar with SDGs and GCED and ESD, and can competently discuss it, can discuss it in the legal framework of national laws and also of the global politics. Thank you very much, Professor Harmon Walker. Charles, Monica, any thoughts on this or immediate comments?
Well, I'll jump in again. I think this is an excellent suggestion. It's the idea of building on your own strengths, your own discipline, and then figuring out how you can bring it in. Now, when I'm working with universities, so many do not see how the SDGs can certainly apply to them, you know, whether they're in mathematics or philosophy and so on. But that's exactly how we need to have people understand what their particular discipline can contribute to the bigger picture. Now, we also need the bigger picture people who are running our institutions of higher education, running our K through 12 school systems and so on, to see the big picture of what's needed. But no one can do it all. Everyone has something. And so this idea of even seeing how many of the students understand what are the SDGs and what is a responsibility, I would build on that and even say how many professors, how many teachers see that, and in measuring the transformation of school systems. Monica?
I can only support what Charles has said. I agree with the statement that unfortunately many don't yet know about the SDGs. And this is surprising. Of course, my team, myself, Ban Ki-moon himself, has dedicated so much energy to it. One statistic that I heard in the year 2015, it's old, was that only 7% of humankind knows about the SDGs. And I mean, knowing, ladies and gentlemen, is one thing, but then applying them and really making sense of them in your own life is yet a completely different story. And 7% sounded discouraging. But what I witness, and I hope that you can motion this as well, is that more and more, even in my immediate vicinity, but also during my travels when they were still possible before COVID, the SDG signs popped up. Schools were far more engaged on the subject matter than they were still in 2015, more than with the Millennium Development Goals. Suddenly companies, my private sector friends are calling me, asking me, why does this now suddenly appear in our annual report? How come SDGs, you're the Madame SDG in my circle of friends, how come that I'm working for steel, I'm working for cement, I'm working for whatever dirty industry there is, and yet the SDGs have manifested in the business reports of them. Even motorsports, they are focused on the SDGs. So it's finding manifestation, fortunately, more and more. So I think the 7% are not anymore correct. But, and this is the point that has been made also by a comment, of course, knowledge is only one thing. And let me immediately refer to Anne again. Anne has made the comment, my concern is missing the boat given the urgency of these global issues by not thinking more about transformative pedagogies rather than raising awareness, which is not in its own transformative. Very true. And yet I like to draw on the old Greeks when this question is raised, because it's true, Anne, what you say. But the old Greeks figured out someone is a good speaker when he addresses us with logos, ethos, and pathos. And it's very similar here that yes, logos, the awareness raising, the cognitive side of things is only one part of the overall deal. We need to appeal to the hearts and the minds as well. So we need to appeal to the ethos, to the value system. And we need to also be good enough in our communication to have a lot of pathos and urgency in that subject matter to really be transformative. So I fully agree. We can't only stay at the cognitive side of things, and UNESCO, you know, in GCED, SD, they're distinguishing between the cognitive, the socio-emotional, and the behavioral aspects of GCED and ESD. We need to address them all. And that's best done, as Charles said, by integrating it into the existing cloud of syllabi and curricula that we have, that we anyway need to deal with. And yet, with the transformative mindset that Anne usually have, and many of us who are interested in the subject matter believe to have, that we are teaching children for a future we don't know. And we do that with the best of our capacities and the best of our abilities. And we know that some of the skills that I alluded to before will be more essential for them than they were probably in our lifetime, where we have a cradle to grave job. They will have to adjust and adapt all of the time. It will be transformative by nature. So fully agreed, and like a double comment on the two chat remarks.
Perhaps I could make it. Yeah, could I make one quick comment on that transformative? It was kind of what I was hinting at with our education system is too fast. We need to slow down and take the time. We know that for transformation to really occur, the more senses that are involved, the deeper and greater the learning and so on. So it takes time to really do that, to set the stage as to why this really is important, to take the time to really engage in different ways, thinking about it, reading about it, yes, talking about it, discussing it, and then in the end, the reflection and so on. All of these steps take time, and when you're standing there with 35 or 40 students and trying to arrange all of that, it's extremely difficult. So, and at the same time, cover the plethora of things that are required in today's curriculum. We also need to be thinking outside of formal education. If we are going to really transform things, we have to align what we learn in school with what we see in the community, what we see around us, that whole idea of total immersion of learning. So it's extremely important, and it's something we need to learn to do, and we're going to have to engage many different disciplines and ideas with psychology, sociology, philosophy, you know, in trying to do this.
May I ask, Charles, I know it's a bit unusual, but I'm relatively young to the field. I'd say I have not spent more than 10 years in the field. You are a veteran. You have seen this develop ever since you started your academic career. My question to you would be, is there hope? Are we getting better, or are we standing and static, or do you see improvement? Is the topic picking up indeed?
Oh,
GCED.
yeah. Oh, I'm extremely hopeful, because we're gathering more and more disciplines and ideas and approaches to see global citizenship education and education for sustainable development mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals and highlighted and so on. Now it's up to higher education and education in general, the leaders of our education systems, to rise to the occasion and also be rewarded with funding and so on. We need our voices at the table as national strategies are being developed and so on. Understand, education can't just be taken for granted and say, oh, well, yes, the teachers should do that. It has to be embedded in teacher education. There's knowledge, skills, resources, understanding, lifelong learning, professional, you know, on and on. But I am extremely hopeful, and I think we're on the move.
Okay, thanks everybody. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. I wish we had much more time, as I wish that our world had much more time to achieve sustainability. But I guess we have to take it one step at a time, from hearts and minds then to the hands. I want to thank also Dr. Chikere and Dr. Geer about their comments, which are available to everybody in the chat about a program at York University and the initiatives around SDG 15, also very interesting topic in Nigeria. And with this, I would like to hand over to Lana, who has been working very diligently and creatively on wrapping up our discussions here. And I wish I had remotely her talent to illustrate these complex topics.
Thank you, Andreas. So let's see a short summary of the Q&A we just heard. And as you say, talent, I want to make one remark, because I hear this very often. I wish I could run out. You just have to spend a lot of time with it. And I see a parallel there to the SDGs. And what Charles said, we just have to spend a lot of time and effort on it, and then it might work. Sorry. Q&A. Okay, so we heard the first question: how do we benefit from the program in Africa? And Monica mentioned a mentorship program, especially dedicated to young women in health, that is still running up, as well as a course for African scholars that's going on. So the teacher educators have access to a local network, which is a basic idea and a fundamental that they engage with the community. And the second question that we heard was one that is apparently a very big one and not so 100% yet. So everybody who has great ideas is very welcome. The question is how to measure change in the teaching practice. And you can only improve something that you can measure, and you can only get better if you know where you are to start from and where you are later in time. There is, even though, an amazing increase in involvement, which we see within the young community, like the Fridays for Future movement, and youth demands more. They demand more from future jobs that they're taking. They're asking in schools for programs. So the change is also happening bottom up. Another question was how early childhood teachers can participate for qualitative practices. And here we heard 4 samples, which were very nice. One is to focus on collaboration, which can already happen with little kids who are playing in the sandbox, literally, but also using music, using cooking or fairy tales like The Emperor Without Clothes to address those topics, even if the kids do not have a very broad like literature knowledge on the topic, but still they can access it from an emotional level if we give them the right tools. And then the last part that I captured was to knowing about the SDGs and to manifest it in the practice. And Monica mentioned that the Greeks, they had 3 important parts to becoming a good speaker, which I thought is very interesting, which is logos, ethos, and pathos, and how important it is to have all 3 of those. So not only to argue from a logical perspective, but also to address values and to put those things into action in the end. Which is a very good last word for me, put it into action.
Charles, Monica, yeah, do you want to add something to the visual impressions?
All great. Thank you, Lana. As always, it's so nice to see the artwork of it. And I think you captured many points very well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is an example of the more senses involved, the greater and deeper the learning experience, you know, because you hear the discussion, you see us speaking, but to see it reviewed again in a different way, there are things that will jump out at each one of us. And so I must say that the pedagogy of this one has been enhanced by your work, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lana, for these great illustrations. Thanks to our 2 panelists. Thanks to everybody in the audience for their questions. And I would like to now hand over to Hannes for the closing remarks of our webinar today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Many thanks to our distinguished speakers and to you, Andreas, for moderating. Thank you, great job. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to listen and to participate in the discussion. I'm glad that we could highlight 2 of the guiding principles of quality education today. Principles which are not only targets in Sustainable Development Goal number 4, but also fundamental concepts for the 2030 agenda as a whole. With education for sustainable development and global citizenship education at the core of sustainable development, we can better address the urgent challenges of our time: respect for human rights, climate change, biodiversity loss, just to name a few examples. Speaking of education, Austria strongly supports UNESCO's efforts as the mandated agency for the implementation of the education goal. Austria will strengthen its engagement with UNESCO through its candidature for a seat on UNESCO's executive board for term 21 to 2025. Now, I believe we have seen in our discussion that education for sustainable development and global citizenship education are 2 sides of the same coin. They complement each other, and they are both key to achieving responsible and transformative action. We are not only following a global strategic plan towards sustainable development, the 2030 agenda, we will also have to look into rebuilding our world in a more sustainable manner after the pandemic. In this respect, I would like to encourage you to get involved in events and future activities, such as the upcoming UNESCO World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development from May 17th to May the 19th. Also, you may want to check out the event Transformative Education Implementing SDG 4.7. This is an event organized by the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens and Bridge 47. Take place during the UNESCO World Conference on May the 17th. The registration link can be found in the chat. I also invite you to sign up for our newsletters. Details are also available in the chat. In closing, I would like to draw your attention once more to the wonderful illustrations by Lana Lauren, which I believe also highlight the importance of arts in the digital space. Thank you, Lana. We appreciate you sharing your art with us. Thank you very much. Stay safe and healthy, and see you soon.